Hey everybody, so this is going to be a part 2 of site modeling. Specifically, this is going to be for the studio process and not so much something that we need for the skills course. So far you should have something that looks something like this, where you have the buildings built in the skills course, hopefully placed within appropriate locations that you can bring into your model. So I'm going to show you how to go from this and get to the point where we can actually have a three-dimensional site based on topography with actual curbs, where everything is solid geometry. So when we do a clipping plane on this, which I'll just do a click one real quick just so I can show you. And of course it didn't actually clip what I wanted it to, but we'll just move this. It's going to clip as a solid. So it understands this thing is a solid. The earth has mass to it. There is actually something solid beneath your building. So essentially this is going to be that process. And I'm going to start not from this model that's already been mostly completed at this point, and not from that, but from the public pool site clean. The file is distributed with assignment 7, I believe. First thing I'm going to do is just eliminate these numbering things, and going to use this as my reference in order to create the site. So I'm going to turn all my layers on. Again, I deleted the one layer that I didn't need. And what I'm actually going to do is go to my topography layer, make that my active layer, which should have a check mark on it right there. And I'm actually going to just lock all of my other layers. That way, as I'm drawing, I can't accidentally start moving things around. I can still see them for visual reference, but that's going to be it. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to type in C-plane. Oh, actually, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm actually just going to go to set C-plane and named C-planes. I think you can also type in the command name C-planes. Because I want to save the C-plane that's the default in this file. It's this rotated one, it's this aligned to the site. It'll be useful later, but I don't need it initially. And then I want to actually just, with this open, click on the world C-plane, or double click on it so you can see it shifts. This is the model 00, whereas this C-plane is the sort of temporary 00 that you can use for drafting purposes. And it's also at a tilted angle, which is useful. So the reason I wanted to do this is I want to create a rectangle that I'm going to use to cut my topography lines. I could make a topography surface for all of the lines here, but in general, it's not recommended to do such a large surface because of how much data that involves, how complex the surface will be, and just it'll probably slow down your file. So the best practice is to always sort of draw out a rectangle of, I'm going to turn off my snaps right now because I don't need them. Just kind of centering the site, which is this curve here, where the word site appears. I want to kind of center that so it's in the center of where I'm going to make my topography surface. And this is the same process I went through at the end of the last video, but I'm just redoing it again, just in case. So I'm going to use that rectangle that I made to trim. So I'm just going to trim all the curves that are intersecting with it, and just try to get as close as you can. Sometimes you might have to come back and pick out the ones that are just barely crossing. So it's a little bit of a tedious task, but shouldn't be too bad. And you can see by dragging from the right to the left, I get a dash selection that allows me to select anything it touches, whereas left to right, everything has to be fully within the rectangle. So that's probably something you already knew at this point, but it is a very useful trick to know if you didn't. Anyway, so I'm about done. Once I've trimmed everything, then I can just go and delete everything that isn't intersecting. Now again, because I have my layers locked, this works pretty well, where I can just make selections and not have to worry about deleting any of my other line work. So just a few more. And I think that's good. It's always easier to tell too when we transition to the 3D view, because usually you can see when something's floating off in the distance. Okay, so here's this. I'm going to run a patch command, and I found the UV spacing of 60 by 60 to be fine. If you want more detail, you could go higher, but it does make for a slower process, slower model. We could even lower this if we wanted to have a sort of faster model. It doesn't really matter that much. And the reason being, topography lines are very approximate, especially ones coming from GIS like this. There are times when you're working on a project in an office where you may actually get surveyor provided topography lines and elevation points that are actually measured very precisely. And that's a different story where you would actually want to be a bit more precise. But with these, you're making an approximation of an approximation, so it's already pretty abstract compared to real life. And again, stiffness allows the surface to conform more closely as opposed to being more smooth to the original curves that you're providing. So a higher stiffness value will make a smoother or a less smooth surface, but more closely holding to those topo lines. So I'm just going to put in 5. The higher value, the more stiff it is. I haven't done a huge amount of experimentation about how high you need to go to make it absolutely perfect stiff without it looking terrible, but 5 seems to work fine for my experience. So I'm going to hit OK, and then I'm actually going to pause the video, or the recording, I should say, because it does take a little bit. For an area this large on my computer, it takes about 2 minutes. It's not too bad, but if I did the entire topographic surface, it'd probably take 10 minutes. And again, more detail than necessary and larger file than necessary. You don't really need to understand the site section 300 feet away from your building necessarily. Maybe that's different for you're on a hillside or something, but anyways, I'm just gonna hit OK. So that only took about 30 seconds for me, actually. A couple good things to keep in mind when running a command like this that you know is going to be a bit slower. It's a good idea to not have anything else running, so don't have Photoshop, InDesign, Illustrator. Do as I say, not as I do. I apparently have those running. Try to minimize other tasks. General good policies when just trying to give your computer as best chance as it can to actually process things, and give it time, let it finish. In this case, it only ended up taking 30 seconds, but will definitely vary depending on the hardware you're using and a billion other factors. Anyways, so I have that. I want to be able to clip that surface to the original rectangle that I had. So I'm just going to extrude the curve that we used just to get a box like this. So you can see I'm currently in wireframe. I'm going to turn that into shaded just so we can see. So it created an open box. It could have been a closed box. It doesn't really matter. Closed box actually probably would have been a better idea. So let's do that again. So when I do extrude, I want to make sure solid is set to yes. And I just need it to be taller than the surface. Because what we're going to do is we're going to click the surface. And actually, so we're going to click this box. And then we're going to type in trim. And we're going to click our surface. So what that did is trimmed it so that the only surface that's remaining is the one inside the box. So it fits perfectly to that original rectangle. Now, I'm going to do a split command. You could do trim, but I found split to be a little bit more consistent here. So I want to select this object to split, hit enter, and this object is my cutting object. And you can see here, it split it. Now these two are not joined, so they're currently under properties. Well, it says varies, but if we were to select one, open poly surface and a trimmed surface. If we select both and hit join, they will become one closed poly surface. And that's generally what we want, because we want this to be a singular object that, again, is closed, so that when we make clipping plane cuts into it, it reads with a poche and is a solid object. It also allows us to, say, when we're cutting into the ground for a swimming pool or something like that, we can do booleans that will subtract away from the earth really easily and really effectively. Okay, so that is the first step that we have to do. The next thing that we're going to do is, I'm actually just going to briefly group these, just so nope, not ground plane. Type in group, and that's just so that I can keep them organized. I'm actually also going to, well, I should have been doing this on the site layer as opposed to the topography layer, but that's okay. I'm actually just going to pull them down. I want them to be below my line work, and that's going to be helpful later on. Under properties, I'm going to turn off isocurves too, just so that the surface reads a little bit more smoothly. I'm actually just going to ungroup. What I am going to group is the topography lines themselves. instead of the box and the topography lines. That way I can select all those lines at once and make them disappear. And the box that I've created with the topographic surface on top, I'm actually going to move to my site layer. You can create a new layer if you want. This is the one that was included in the model. It'll work fine. You're just trying to keep organized by layers as much as possible. So the next thing we want to do is we want to be able to get the curbs. So the streets are typically about 6 to 8 inches below the height of a curb. It does vary and depend. I'm just going to use 8 inches just as sort of a standard, but you know, if we were being really precise, we'd go out and actually measure what it is. Actually, let's just do 6 inches. It doesn't really matter too much, but we'll just have enough that we can see some depth, that we can see that the curb is higher than the road. So what we want to do is I'm going to go to top view, and I'm going to turn off, I'm actually not going to work with sidewalks. I'm going to turn off the parcels and the buildings. Oops. Turn off the buildings and off the topography. The reason being is I just want to be able to see, and they're currently locked. I just want to be able to see these outlines and make up the roads. So I'm going to select all of them real quick. And I only want to select the roads themselves. So I'm just going to do select objects by right-clicking on the layer and type in join. Because these are going to be easier to work with if they are joined curves. Now, I know for a fact that some of these don't join perfectly, because I've already done this once and figured out that here, if we zoom in, we can see these two don't actually touch. We want to make sure that every one of these curves that intersects with this box is joined. It will help us tremendously later. So I'm going to turn on the project tab in the bottom left-hand corner down here. And that will only appear if you have the snaps set to on, the O snap. And project is just going to make sure that I'm not working on a three-dimensional plane. I'm just working on a 2D plane. So I'm just going to bring these points together, which I almost did correctly. The snapping, I currently have end snap on, which is going to allow me to snap the two curves together. Now this, I think that's all I needed to do for this one. Oh, it's never going to read as a closed curve because it doesn't have the end here. But I do want to make sure that I fix any of these points where curves aren't intersecting. So I know I need to do this one as well. And again, I know this because I went through the process and figured out which of these curves are kind of screwy. And I think that these just need to be attached properly. So there's an issue kind of where this curve meets that curve, and there's also an issue where this curve meets this curve. So if we look here, there's an overlap, so we just have an extra bit of line there. And now I think that should allow these to join. It did join into an open curve, so there's still one more area of an issue. If they do join, and it still says open curve, the command end bulge will show you where, and I don't know why it's called that, but basically where your extra points are. So something in here is extra, so I'm just going to delete and rejoin these things. And now it should read as closed curve. Okay. So I think this one is another one that has an issue. And again, this is just something that I figured out as I was making these, that one of these or a couple of these don't work very well. If you were going through the process, you would eventually see the same error that's going to occur, or that would occur. So we're just trying to avoid them now. And join, still open, so end bulge. And looks like right here. I'm just going to delete that, and that fixed that guy. So I'm going to select all the curves that should be fully closed curves and just make sure that they are reading as closed curves. And you can see here under properties, the type says closed curve, so that's good. It'll start saying varies the second we get one. Oh, here's one. So this is clearly very far off. I'm just going to delete this. Now I'm not being too precise about this because these lines really aren't that precise. So what's more important is just making sure that they're closed in their exact original form. And so it's one open curve now, so I still need to find end bulge and figure out what the other extra point is here. So I think if I delete this, now it's closed curve. So I think that's almost all of them. Those are all closed. That one's never going to be closed because it's clearly open on one end. Okay. So the other thing I want to do is, our site, as shown, has an alleyway going through it. I'm going to eliminate that because really, you're probably not going to put an alleyway through your site. And so the way I'm just going to do this is just sort of connect the straight lines across. I'm currently drawing on the site layer. It doesn't actually matter what layer I draw on. All that matters is that I draw curves that connect, because now I can use these to trim and just join that. So it didn't quite join, so I'll have to get rid of that. And I'll bring that back to my roads. So now this is shown as one big shape. That's going to be a lot easier to work with than having a alleyway go down the center of our site being this general shape right here. Okay, I think that's all we need to do there. And again, it's just a little bit of 2D cleaning that will drastically help with the next step. So essentially what we want to do is we want to be able to get these curves onto that surface. So I'm just going to go and select all the curves. I think I'll include our site too. But basically anything that's intersecting with that original box that we drew. And that should be good. I only want to have curves selected, so I just deselected that box. Okay. Now, the command you want to use, and I'm actually going to make one change before I actually do that command, is going to be project, which will project lines onto another surface. But I want to, if I project onto this surface, it's actually going to project the lines running down the surface as well, since it is a poly surface. So I want to be able to get a duplicate of that top face. So I think there's a couple ways you can do it. I thought there might be a dupe surface. Dupe face border, that won't do it. So I'm just going to do it the way I know. There might be a better way of doing this, but I'm just going to explode the box, select that top surface. I'm just hitting copy to clipboard, and I'm going to paste it, and I'll just move that guy up 15 feet. So what I did is just basically broke the poly surface into individual surfaces and copied the top surface upwards. You can see it's now floating 15 feet above, and it's good to make sure you type in a number so you can undo it later. And with the box that I originally had, I'm just going to join it again just by hitting join. So that just had all the surfaces selected, so when you type in join, it'll go back to a closed poly surface. But I wanted this surface to be by itself just because it's going to go a lot faster for me. And again, I'm just going to select everything that I want to be projecting, which is just these curves here. And I don't need that text. And type in the command, project. It's going to ask for a surface, and I'm going to use that loose surface that I just created, and hit OK. Now this might take a second. Didn't actually take too long, so that was OK. But what I'm going to do is actually create a new layer to put these on, just so I can keep organized. I'll make a sub layer within my site and call that streets. And change object layer, make this a different color. And I'll show you the reason why, because I want to be able to just see it. And because I know I'm using red already, I'm going to make that another color as well. Let's make that blue. So these curves now are three-dimensional. They're sitting on that surface, which is going to be very useful for us. I'm just going to hide these extra curves. Because now I'm going to take this surface and I'm going to do a split command. I'm going to ask for cutting objects, and I'm going to use these curves. Because they are sitting on the surface already, they're going to cut our surface pretty nicely. This also may take a couple minutes, So I am going to pause the video and come back, and I'll let you know how long it took. It literally finished the second I clicked pause, so it only took me maybe 10 or 15 seconds. Again, your experience will vary depending. Now, this is going to be the big reason why we wanted to make sure that what we started with was closed geometry, is it won't actually subdivide this surface appropriately if your curves that you're starting with that you haven't cleaned up yet aren't closed. This piece down here, I know for a fact, just won't cut out. So you want to make sure that you do that step. Now what I'm going to do is select all these surfaces except for the road. So I just selected everything and deselected the road because that was the easiest way. And I am just going to extrude curve, or actually not extrude curves, I'm going to do extrude face or surface. And I'm going to do -6 inches. Now, for whatever reason, sometimes extrude wants to go in one direction or another. I found, for whatever reason, it wanted to go in negative direction. Doesn't really matter. So I just typed in -6 inches. Maybe yours will be 6 inches positive, but negative seemed to work fine. But what you want to do is, again, type in -6 inches. It's going to take a second to process that. Oh, never mind. So when I did it in the demo before, it needed negative, but now it needs positive. So I take back what I said. I'm just going to do 6 inches. But essentially what it's going to be is, once it's done processing, all right, so it didn't do what I expected again, so I'm just going to lower this 6 inches. This is what we're ultimately aiming for, though. We want to have this surface. Ooh, actually, I'm going to undo that real quick. And the reason being is there's a couple settings that are going to be really useful to do. So I'm going to just select everything again, deselect the road, extrude surface. And when I do it, I want to select delete input yes. Solid yes. And now 6 inches. And hopefully it goes in the right direction. Look at that, it did. Definitely want to delete surfaces, though, as part of that process, else we'll end up with more surfaces than we need. Now I'm going to come back and, with all these selected, again, do the same thing, which is just turn off the ISO curve density so that they appear smooth. So now we have solids, closed solid poly surfaces, sitting on top of our, well, a trimmed surface right now because we haven't extruded the street. We don't actually need to either. I'm actually going to delete that street out because I want to actually just apply these closed poly surfaces back to this general mass that we already created. And this is why lowering at a specific amount, in which case I did 15 feet before, will be very useful, because if I just type in 15, they will go back together and these edges are just going to snap together. And now I can do a process of Booleaning if I want these to all be the same surface, which is going to be the best way of doing it, but it is a little time consuming. So you could leave it like this, where each one of these is kind of floating on this sort of larger object. The only downside is you could accidentally move one without realizing it if they're not locked. And then when drawing a clipping plane, I'm going to do a vertical one real quick. They are going to register as separate objects sitting on the earth as opposed to attached to the earth. So the other way of doing, or the good way of doing this would be to select objects one by one and just do a Boolean union. You could technically select all of these and do a Boolean union at once, but I found the more objects you Boolean union at a time, the more likely it is to fail. So I might try 3 and see if that works. Because it has to process which objects are intersecting. So with just 2 objects, it knows it only needs to process the relationship between those 2. But as soon as you add in a 3rd or 4th, now it has to process the relationship between each of those individual poly surfaces, which slows things down. It does work, but it is slower. So you could just piece by piece add in these individual poly surfaces. So each time I'm just selecting a new one and hitting enter to redo the last command. And I'm actually just going to do all of these and pause the video real quick and I'll come back. Okay, so that only took a couple minutes, but basically I booleaned all of them together. So if I click on this, it is one closed poly surface. This will cut very nicely when we do any sort of clipping planes. So that was the sort of biggest and first step that we have to take. That gets us, actual three-dimensional curbs, an actual road that is recessed or lowered a little bit. Now we could come back and say if we wanted to, for rendering purposes, assign different materials to different faces, we could do that. That's not really something I'm going to cover here. And certainly something very easy to do, just a selection in Photoshop to just change the color of the road or something in a perspective or something like that. So I'm not too concerned about that right now. I really just wanted this to be one large poly surface, again, more for the sake of getting a really nice clipping plane going than anything else. So the next steps I'm going to do are, so I have the sidewalks and the roads, the parcels. Most of this doesn't really need to be directly applied to the surface. I could do the same thing and type in project and have all these things directly lay on top of, but in most cases, they're honestly going to be easier to use as just a 2D surface and just only let the stuff that really needs to be three-dimensional be three-dimensional. So with that, I'm just going to leave them as is. Now this guy, I'm going to drag up, and you can see here that there's no good way of putting it sort of right below all of our line work because the line work is, on a flat surface and it's going to be, again, probably most useful that way, where our site really isn't a flat surface. So I might just take, say, one of these points, moving with sort of a vertical snap on, and maybe move this edge up. So that might be my sort of compromise state where most of the lines are still visible. Some things up here where the road or the topography goes up a little higher aren't visible anymore. But you kind of just have to pick a point and stick with it. So the next thing is, at this point, you should have buildings built that you did in Skills that you can bring in. Now, the way I'd suggested doing that in Skills is using the work session. I've heard that some people are having trouble or that this doesn't fully work in the Mac side, in which case the insert command should work fine for you. There is one little weird eccentricity with the insert command so the way you want to do this is make sure insertion point is set to off, and you just select the pull site, and I'm going to use this as linked. And I hope it's actually going to do this wrong. It didn't. It appeared weird, sort of. So you might have seen I stole one of the section's models just for the sake of this demo. So this dropped into the correct place. Now, it did so as I wanted it to. But had I done that insertion command with my C-plane, I'm going to turn to wireframe so we can see things. My C-plane were the C-plane that's aligned to the site, it's not going to drop in a correct place. It'll actually drop skewed off of, because for whatever reason, insertion uses whatever your active C-plane is as its 0, 0, as opposed to the world C-plane. So you want to just make sure that if you're going to do the insertion method of bringing the models in, that your current world plane is set as the world plane, or your current C-plane is set as the world plane. And then they should bring in insert properly. I'm going to use the work session model and just attach. And master file. So that'll bring those guys in. Now, the next thing you're going to notice is the buildings are probably going to be at times floating above a surface. So we can see underneath this building here. And that's something we're going to want to fix. There's also likely, you might notice there's a few probable errors that are happening with either buildings being out of place, rotated wrong, or something that just doesn't look quite right. So now that you've downloaded the model onto your own computer, I'd encourage you to go back and try to fix these things. So the biggest one I see here is this building is sitting way out on the sidewalk. It should be aligned to the parcel line, but for whatever reason is shifted off of it. Now in this model, if I try moving it, it's not going to do anything because it's a work session, so it won't allow us to. But what we can do is I can open up that work session, which is just opening up that same file, which I have right here. And you can see that that guy is the guy that shifted off. I'm going to go back to the file I was just working in, and I want to take the surface that I made, and I'm also select all of my parcels. So I have that surface and the parcel selected. I hit Control C to copy it, go to the other file and hit Control V. It's going to automatically populate into the same location. And I can just use this now as a reference to move things around. So in the top view, I'm going to turn my project on, which it already is, go to wireframe. And I know I just want to move this guy. It should align back to its parcel. I noticed this particular model is not aligned to parcel and also seems to be flipped. So if we look at it in the perspective, you can see there's windows facing this side, and I think that's incorrect. I mean, it's clearly incorrect. That's not where a window would go. I mean, there's windows against the building. They should be on the other side. So I actually suspect this whole thing is just rotated 180 degrees. So I'm just going to select it and its elevations and just do a 180 degree rotation, which I think fixes just about everything. Now you may have this issue too, where elevations seem to be disappearing in certain views. And that's really just a consequence of, if we zoom in from the top, we can see they're not perfectly aligned on rotation. So I'm just going to do the rotate command and try to realign them so that the faces are perfect. Now that won't disappear. I know this model, I think, has the same issue on these guys here. Since there are blocks, I'll have to double click to go into them. But I'm just going to do the same thing of, looks like this one might be a little harder to fix because it's not quite grouped. Because I only want to select the one face. So that one will take a little longer to fix. I might actually do this the other way, which is, so this guy's already projecting onto the sidewalk somewhat. So I might just do an approximation and cut this thing back and then realign the faces to it. Just going to Boolean, remove that. So the faces are now floating out in front. But, type in group. Nope, not ground plane. Always happens to me. I'm going to align one of my points to a face. And now I'll do the rotate command again so that I can pull this guy into alignment with my object. And now they're fixed. Okay, so the next thing to do is bring these down to the ground. So we could try to be really precise about this, but I'm actually just going to use the gumball tool and look until I see that they're intersecting. So you can see here, there's a light intersection. I'm just going to make sure my building is sitting ever so slightly below the ground surface. And just do this for each one of these. So it's never going to be, perfectly straight. So you can see here it's lower in one end versus the other. That's probably fairly realistic to the actual building condition. And of course, all these buildings do vary in height quite a bit and vary in elevation based on the street that they're on. So you might get something like this. It might be easier to move this guy up a little bit. Again, just do your sort of approximate best, shifting things around. Once you are done and you've got your buildings, fixed up, properly placed, I'm just going to go in and make it back to just the building. So delete the lines and delete that site. and save this guy. Now go back to the file that I was working in, which I think was one of these, this one. So if I go to work session, manage, and click on the work session file that we've linked in, I can hit the update button and it should shift everything. And now your buildings are still in a work session, still inserted, or still brought into the model, but not actively living in the model, but now will be better aligned to geometry. So again, I would have wanted to shift all the buildings vertically. I only needed a few for this example. So that's going to be mostly what I was going to cover here. I'll just mention a few other things that are sort of good practice. So again, we started with, I talked about how there was a seaplane dedicated to this project that started in the project when you open it for the first time. And to see it, I'm just going to make sure wireframe's on. So right now it is sitting, I think, just below the surface. So with this thing on, if I have project on, I'm always going to be drawing on it, project being the button down here. Now if I start drawing, I'm going to be drawing on that surface. Now it's probably going to be just below the way I have this modeled. So if I turn on shaded, or it's maybe just above, yeah, there it is. So if I extrude this curve, oh, that didn't want to work. It didn't actually make that very well. What I'm trying to do is just get it. So there we go. Now it's intersecting. Now your project, what you're probably going to want to do is do some manipulation to the ground plane. Buildings are typically built on uneven surfaces as the world is not flat. But if you're making a patio surface or something for people to walk on, people tend to like to walk on flatter surfaces. So it might be a good idea to sort of start thinking about a plinth that you'd want people to use. So that could be, you know, again, something you'll do in your design process, but actually giving yourself some kind of flat surface to work on. And then that could be aligned to your actual 0, 0. So I'm just going to click on this corner. So this is on my 0. And this is going to be something you'll have to kind of figure out because, you know, now it is projecting fairly high. So if you had your pool at that surface, you can see it's now 5 feet above the sidewalk, which may not be the best thing for you. So you may have to you have a subtle amount of slope that you'll have to deal with in some way. So that may be terracing this down. So maybe it's not just one platform, but multiple. But it is something you want to think about. But the big advantage of, and why we did this is, why we wanted to make sure that we are modeling things as solids, is once you have decided where your pool is going to go, you can just do a Boolean difference to subtract away the earth. This also applies for buildings that have basements. So it's a good thing to, again, always work in solids in Rhino. It's just generally good practice, but allows you to continue doing these sort of manipulations like this. Okay, so that's it for this one. Again, don't need to worry about doing all of this specific site modeling stuff for your skills assignment, but this is something you should try to do for your studio work. So hope this helps. Let me know if there are any issues. Thanks.